Black Clock Audio Tales, June 2019. Mary Shelley's Frankenstein and The Last Man. Brought to you by BunnySlippers.com. Check out their brand new Dino sound slippers. Slippers make a roaring sound every 3 steps, made with green, scaly fabric, soft plush uppers, foam footbeds, non-slip grips on the soles so you don't fall, and 3 white claws on each foot. One size fits most, up to a woman's 10.5 and a men's 9. Footbed measures 10.5 inches. Black Clock Audio Tales is a daily podcast about weird fiction, gothic horror, folklore, fantasy, ancient poems of rats and frogs fighting in a Homeric satire. Yeah, we got that too. We got a bunch of Lovecraft. We got a bunch of Robert E. Howard, Sir Arthur Conan Doyle. We got it. I mean, we're Black Clock Audio Tales. Look for our podcast anywhere you find podcasts. We suggest Podbean, Apple Podcasts, and why not go to Stitcher? Find us on the web at pgttcm.com and at Black Clock Audio on Instagram, Twitter, and Facebook, and Black Clock Audio Tales on YouTube, in case you feel like watching us on YouTube for some reason. Check out People's Guide to the Cthulhu Mythos on the last Tuesday of this month. I released one today, which is Memorial Day, and it's an episode where Cody Goodfellow talks about how much he loves shoggoths, and how we're all shoggoths. That's the takeaway from it. I mean, he's not wrong, according to the People's Guide to the Cthulhu Mythos. Anyway, check out the website over at pgttcm.com, edited by DB Spitzer, music by Kevin MacLeod. The Chamber, Unseen Horror, The Voices. Produced at Badger's Drift Studio. Find out how to visit and record with us at pgttcm.com. Help support the show by going to paypal.me/pgttcm and donate $1 or $5, or pgttcm/podbean.com and become a patron. Help the show by sharing, rating, liking, or 5-star giving wherever you listen to, rate, or podcasts. That sentence wrong. Help the show by sharing, liking, or 5-star giving wherever you listen to podcasts. Buy a cool shirt at pgttcm/threadless.com. PGTTCM is part of the Dark Myths Collective. Learn more at darkmyths.org. All right, and we are back with more Frankenstein, and today we've got Bob with us. Bob, can you let the listeners at home know who you are?
Hi, I'm Bob Kester. I am an author in the... my biggest ongoing thing is a podcast called Immunities, which is a sort of the aftermath of a successful invasion of the body snatchers like scenario, where a few humans have turned out to be immune to it, and how that all works. Also wrote a novel, which is also an audiobook called Insistent Oracles, which is about a couple of astronomers who sort of accidentally achieve first contact with some aliens. But I also did an hour-long audio drama called Companions, which is sort of in a sci-fi realm that I consider very close to where Frankenstein is, and so that was one of the things I was going to be talking about.
Cool. Very cool.
And which, to be more specific about that, is just things that I learned about sci-fi horror from reading Frankenstein and other stuff from that era, from like Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde and Island of Dr. Moreau, which all just have some, they face some of the problems of that genre, and they solve them in interesting ways, I thought, which would be interesting to analyze.
All right, and what were these problems that arise from the genre?
Well, one is, since they're trying to mix sci-fi and horror, is that, science, the whole point of science is to create replicable results.
Mm-hmm.
That once you've discovered something, then everybody should be able to do it.
Yeah.
But if you want to have horror, especially if it's going to be sort of personal horror sort of thing, and there should be a sense of it being limited to something that that to the characters in your story.
Mm-hmm.
If it's going to be like cosmic horror, a Lovecraftian type thing where like we're constantly dancing on the edge of like the whole world being destroyed or something, or an apocalyptic zombie type horror, then that's not as important. But for like sort of a long-term story involving a limited number of characters, you want the horror, even if it comes out of science, to be something that's sort of limited to those characters. And so that's one thing about it. And so the way they all do is to focus on your mad scientist type person.
All right.
And so it seems like only this mad scientist can create whatever supernatural, seemingly supernatural effect it is that creates the horror. And B, even they don't have total control over it. Which I think is interesting, in the way you approach that. Like in Jekyll and Hyde, he solves, he keeps trying to solve his problem, and he solved it at some point, but accidentally, and he doesn't know exactly when, through a mistake. As often happens through science, especially at that time, it's like, you make your breakthrough by mistake because you did something other than what you were really planning to do, and which is what Jekyll did, but he didn't know that he was doing it when he did it, and so he doesn't know it, but so he can't do it again. Whereas with Frankenstein, I think it's interesting because it's more from the makeup of Victor Frankenstein himself that he has this weird sort of self-education where he spends years and years reading, learning like more about alchemy and how alchemy works than like any modern person really would probably know.
Yeah.
And really believing in it all, and having this alchemical drive, to find like the root causes of things, which he considers at variance with the way like scientists work. And then later he has to forget it all and learn science, but it seems like that sort of sticks with him and is the reason why he, unlike anybody else, can like find this secret to the well springs of life, which nobody else can find.
Yeah.
And then you combine it with him immediately deciding that it's not something that anybody else should know, so he's never going to tell anybody, even hint at it to anybody like about how it works.
Yeah, that's quite an interesting thing about I don't know, the subgenre of science fiction horror that is mad scientists.
Yeah, exactly. And it's cool, because they personify within themselves, sort of the line between science fiction and horror, and it becomes like a very character. It keeps the characters of the story from being overwhelmed by the science or by the horror, because this one person, all the science and horror is sort of coming out of them. And so what they decide to do, their decisions are always the most important thing, because that's Frankenstein's monster, is not going to be able to populate the world with creatures like himself unless Dr. Frankenstein makes him a female to mate with, and he ain't gonna. So,
yeah, and just
like
to let you know, Ken Height and I had a conversation about whether or not it's okay to call Frankenstein's creature Frankenstein because his father was Dr. Frankenstein. And he could be like, well, Dr. Frankenstein's my father. Just call me Frankenstein.
Just call me Frankie. Yeah. Well, once I saw somebody who did a nice Hegelian thing on it, which is thesis.
Yeah.
Frankenstein is a monster. Antithesis, Dr. Frankenstein created the monster.
Sure.
Therefore, synthesis, Dr. Frankenstein is a monster.
Oh, it always seems like anytime Frankenstein is brought up, more than any other classic monster, I feel, philosophy is quick to follow.
Oh, that's true. Well, it's partially because he's very versed in it, and like
sure.
And it seems like the whole book is, some of it is Mary Shelley either exploring philosophy or trying to propagate philosophy of her own, and get people to, and a lot of interesting political messages she throws in along the way. She has I would consider some pretty modern opinions about a lot of things.
Yeah, definitely.
And she's sort of like, maybe if people were just a little more, a little less crazy about the way they went about things, maybe she has this whole vision of how like colonizing of the Americas might have gone better, and and all this stuff. So she's definitely like wide-ranging ideas, but once again, she keeps the story very centered on those characters, even if the implications are worldwide.
Do you feel that Frankenstein makes a good blueprint for a science fiction horror? I mean, gothic horror, or in your opinion, as a writer creator?
Oh yeah, I mean definitely. I mean, as I say, it faces some of the problems, which I haven't gotten to some of the other ones yet. Of that, and solves them. I think mostly elegantly. I guess to a modern reader, including myself, sometimes it seems like a little more length than is absolutely necessary. But we've had the benefit of people basically getting to like use her ideas and refine them for a couple hundred years now. And she did not.
Yeah.
So, but as a blueprint, I think it's really good. I really like. I'll just jump into another thing, which is the structure of books of that time, which is something that's often lost when in movie adaptations. That, well, I think at this point is where you were really developing, because then it also goes hand in hand with the science fiction horror thing. That because the horror arises out of science, in some sense, it can arise sort of naturally out of the events that happen, as opposed to being some sort of ancient curse that just sort of like falls down on everybody like an enormous gauntlet falling from the sky. And as a result, you could, if you told things strictly chronologically, for somebody who just was interested in the genre content, there might not be anything. If you just started with Frankenstein's birth and just told his story from that point, and people didn't know that the monster was coming, you wouldn't really get to the genre part until like a third or a half or 3/4 of the way through the story. But in a lot of these Victorian period stories, they tell them like way out of chronological order, usually in a frame story from some outside observer. So you see from the beginning, like, what the result of all this was, and then you go back and see the earlier part, and you get sort of a, as Hitchcock would put it, rather than just having the shot, a normal story and then suddenly the shock that something abnormal happens, from the beginning something abnormal is going to happen, and you're just watching these people who don't realize it's going to happen, like, getting farther and closer to it, which I really like.
Nice.
And yeah, so I really admire the structure, and so she uses that structure well, and I think Jekyll and Hyde is probably the best use of it. And once again, it's like manages to compress it into a much shorter thing. And yeah, I've just reread the beginning and end of Frankenstein, and I had forgotten. I knew it started and ended with the sea captain, but I'd forgotten just how much of him there is. Which is something I think would be interesting if it was opened, in an opened up thing. But within the book, even knowing everything I know, I would kind of like, I want to get to the fireworks factory.
Yeah.
And though it is interesting sometimes if you like take yourself out a little bit more than like the book really does, because like Frankenstein's relationship with his sister, I remembered it as being odd, and reading it this time, it's just freaky.
Yeah.
He always refers to her as my more than sister. And,
yeah.
but the fact that this whole story is being told by Frankenstein to the captain, who is then writing it in a letter that he's sending to his sister.
Yeah.
If I was writing, Frankenstein's relationship to his sister to my sister, I would feel very weird about it.
Yeah.
I would probably try to tone things way down. My more than sister, which I wonder if that was, I don't know a lot about their biographies, but I know that, Mary Shelley knew Byron, and that Byron had weird relationships with his siblings, so there might be something about that in there. And I mean, and it's not even limited to that, because it's like, she's also kind of his mother and kind of his daughter, like she's like the whole package, a family package, like in one. And in a way, that kind of relationship is also, sort of a, especially like a stepbrother, stepsister, could be, it's sort of a common Gothic element.
Sure.
And so I think one thing that the structure, sort of the structure of putting like one genre inside another, like through these like frame stories, is that it lets you combine the different genres, but like, having one sort of be looking down on the other, I guess is one bit, so Frankenstein, literally in the case of Dr. Frankenstein, he's like moving into this like science fiction world, but he's doing it through sort of an older magical world, because of his study of the alchemists. and plus constant metaphors he's making about demons and stuff, and and him coming from this sort of gothic tradition, and whereas in Dracula it's kind of almost the opposite, which is like an ancient horror sort of like intruding upon the modern world, and like what effect that what that would look like in a world, vampires suddenly appeared in a world that had steamships and telegraphs and stuff like that. So that's fun. And then putting everything in letters, so much of it in letters. Also, like a letter is such a sort of business-like thing, even if it's a personal letter, that it takes this like magical stuff and kind of reduces it down to words in an interesting way, which in itself like sort of lays a level of science on it. These are observations that somebody is making. So not not something that's happening like with that with the complete immediacy, even though it's like still pretty chilling to hear about, especially since they do a trick that's used on TV a lot, I guess, these days, which is that that this character is going to survive, that this character is going to survive, so you have a bunch of other characters who can be attrited down one by one, and the way that they die is increasingly horrifying.
Sure.
Yeah, so you have people you can worry about who you don't know are going to survive, and as is often in that case, practically all of them get killed.
Yeah.
Let's see. Oh, another lesson, possibly a slightly less technical lesson I learned about this, is not to have a character named Clerval.
Yeah.
It's like no matter what the tone of the scene is, I think as soon as they mention Clerval, I'm just completely out of it.
Yeah.
Like even at the end, like one of the when the monster's giving one of its greatest speeches, and it's like, do you think that I enjoyed hearing the dying sighs of Clerval? Like, I could just see the captain at the time. It's like I attempted to keep my composure and not snicker at the sound of the name Clerval. Although looking at him, I hadn't really thought about this before, but he reminds me a lot of, and this is back to my ill-spent youth reading a lot of Anne Rice, Lestat's friend Nicholas from the Vampire Lestat, where like Lestat is like the scion of this sort of decaying gentry family, and Nicholas is the scion of this rising bourgeois family, and they're both like sort of the dissidents in their families, and they become good friends with each other and go off to the big city, and so that it seemed like I wonder even if Rice might have been inspired by Victor and Clerval, and thinking that there was a lot to be like filled in, a lot of gaps to be filled in that relationship, which he proceeded to do. It is kind of interesting that they put them in Geneva, which is like sort of perfect, because like she can just bring in pretty much any European ethnicity, and they could live within 50 miles of there, because it's Italian and French and German like all smashed up on each other. So like pretty much all the Gothic traditions can like provide her with background.
Sure.
A little bit off to one side, especially it was just that thinking about the Lord Byron connection to Frankenstein, about how with stories like this, they kind of lend themselves to parallels between the making of the story and the story itself, and the adaptations of the story, because they're all about some level of hubris and creativity and mania and monomania and obsession and things like that. And the big one that reminded me of is another sci-fi horror thing, Island of Dr. Moreau.
Yeah.
Which then got made into the movie, various movies, Island of Dr. Moreau, but like including the 90s one, which the documentary about that, Lost Soul, the strange.
Oh yeah.
And it's definitely worth seeing. But you can see how he himself is sort of one of these same heroes. And
sure,
you and I both had the opportunity to see him. I don't know if you actually met him. At,
Richard Stanley.
Yeah. At the Lovecraft Festival.
Yeah, I had a chance to briefly say hey, but we were supposed to be on the same panel at one point in time, but I had to go to the bathroom, and they're like, oh no, DB's not here. Okay, get Chris over there and put him on the panel. Okay. And I sat down and was like, all right, I'm not on the panel.
Yeah, that's how those things work. But it's kind of nice that he's gotten to sort of work his way up to filmmaking by making love, by channeling his mania into Lovecraft stuff. But if you get to see the documentary that they made about his attempt to make Island of Dr. Moreau, it's pretty amazing. I mean, it's kind of like Terry Gilliam making
Don Quixote.
Don Quixote, it's like there's no way that there's not going to be like metaphors arising out of that, and and they were there plentifully. I still haven't seen. I mean, it's finally been made.
Yeah.
I still haven't seen that, but I definitely intend.
Yeah, no, I definitely intend on seeing it someday, but I'm also like, do I want to see it? If I see it, then it's a thing.
Yeah, my wife's a film critic,
Uh-huh.
Tasha Robbins,
Oh, nice.
and she saw it at a festival like months ago,
Hmm.
and I keep forgetting that. And then so she'll say something about, oh, the movie's coming out at such and such a date, and I was like, I don't believe it. And she's like, I saw it on a screen, I saw the entire thing from beginning to end. It's like I just don't believe it.
Yeah, no, it's almost like hearing that Jodorowsky's Dune is gonna be made, or
Exactly. It's like she's visited the library in the Sandman comics where all the unwritten works are, and she's
yeah,
like managed to whip it all on.
we snagged this from a parallel universe. So speaking of movies, something I keep talking to everyone about mostly is so Frankenstein movies. Do you have ones that you think are worthwhile and ones that you're like, maybe shy away from that one?
I think, I mean, I know this is probably the most controversial one, is
Hmm.
my favorite one, which is well recognized as it is Mary Shelley's Frankenstein from, what was that, the 90s?
The one with De
Like,
Niro in it?
yeah, and
Yeah,
Kenneth Branagh.
yeah,
Because I mean, I think, it's almost exact. I mean, it's fun that they called it that, and I imagine it's deliberate, because
sure,
I think its place in the Frankenstein canon is almost exactly where Bram Stoker's Dracula is in the Dracula canon.
yeah,
In like attempting to like readapt it, and adapt parts of the book that almost never get made into movies, and
sure,
then going off in crazy directions of its own, which are not like the old movies or like the old books,
yeah,
and or like the original book. But I really appreciate that, and it just it's obviously the only one that really felt like had any connection to the book, like on
yeah.
a kind of plot level. So and I think I really like. Yeah, I think Brando was good as that character. Do you know, did he direct that too, or was that somebody
I
else?
don't, I don't know. I don't know.
I
Uh,
tend to like him most
yeah.
acting when he's not directing himself, but so it's sort of.
Yeah, no, I remember like being just really kind of irritated with that specific Frankenstein because I was like, yeah, they're covering the book stuff, but that's not what I wanted. I'll
I
read the
remember they also
book.
got the creepiness of the relationship with his sister pretty well.
Yeah, yeah. I was talking to, let's see, who was I? I was talking to Ken Height and Ross Lockhart about Frankenstein, and one that keeps popping up in my mind is Sting as Victor Frankenstein in The Bride from that
All right,
80s Frankenstein movie.
which might be the first one that I saw front to back.
Yeah,
Um, I think about it, just because that's the age I was. I
sure.
was like, in my very early teens
Hmm. Hmm.
or tweens, something like that, when that came out, and so I remember watching that. Which it's funny because unlike like modern horror remake things like Rob Zombie's Halloween, where
Oh,
he's got if he has a new Halloween story, he's basically going to give you 40 minutes. That's the entire old movie, and
yeah,
then show you, and build this like huge long thing. Whereas The Bride, they spend about a minute
yeah,
summing up like the Frankenstein story, and then they just assume you've seen it, and then just move forward from there.
yeah,
And so I can really appreciate. That's really fun. Like just to count on the literacy of your audience like that. As opposed to like, all right, we're going to show you Peter Parker getting bitten by a radioactive spider again.
Hey, Batman's parents are gonna die one more time.
Yeah, there've only been 3 versions of this in the past 20 years, so you might have missed them all. It's possible.
Sure, and that can definitely be said with superhero movies and a lot of the classic horror films. It's like it's like Frankenstein, Dracula. We don't need to know their origin story, and most of the time we never get their origin
It's
story.
true. And now that I think about it, I'd seen other like alloyed Frankenstein. Like I saw, was it Frankenstein meets the Wolfman?
Hmm.
For some reason, just completely at random at some point.
Yeah,
Just an interesting attempt at a movie.
sure, sure.
But
That's like
just like one of the first attempts of like, well, this guy's like this and this guy's like this, so like Lawrence Talbot wants to learn how to die, so he'll try to find the secrets of life and death, and who would have those? Dr. Frank. That's another thing that people, in terms of like mixed genre,
sure,
that people could study, which is that it follows one of the basic rules, which is that if you're going to do a funny movie within a genre, you should still follow the rules of that genre.
Sure, yeah.
And I think Mel Brooks is actually really good at that in that one, like
Mhm,
probably more so than in some of his other, because like his Star Wars parody, I think he doesn't care about Star Wars as much as he cares about Frankenstein.
Yeah.
So even though it's really funny, you don't feel it, you don't feel the emotion of it, I think, as much as you do Young Frankenstein.
Yeah. So, do you have any other things that you think people should know about Frankenstein and Frankenstein's monster?
Either of them, both of them. I mean, they're kind of inseparable
Yeah.
all the way up to the end. So there's no point in sweating the difference too much.
Sure.
No, I think I've covered pretty much all of it. I guess I could talk a little bit about applying these rules a little bit.
Sure.
So I made this Companions is this 1 hour long radio play type thing. And it's basically they're these space stations out in space that beam energy back to Earth, and they've learned that they work best if they just have one person running them. And so there's 3 of them that are important to it, and they can't communicate through real-time messages. They have to sort of send messages, so it sort of lends itself right there to sort of an epistolary structure like Frankenstein has. Wait just a second, I'm letting a cat out.
No problem.
Bye cat. Okay. And then in science fiction can actually bring back other parts of that too, because since you're surrounded by computers, it's kind of like how characters in Victorian horror tend to be surrounded by servants, and who are kind of half characters. And basically one of these 3 figures out how to generate basically virtual life, sort of along the lines of Star Trek: The Next Generation holographic characters, and sees that the other 2 commanders like each other, and so sort of gifts each of them a virtual version of the other one to be their companion, so that they're not like out in space all by themselves. And then things on all 3 stations sort of develop from there in what I wouldn't say is I won't say what direction it goes in, but it goes in a direction.
All right.
And so you can find out more about that at playcompanions.com.
Okay.
Where there's it's, as I say, it's an hour long. It's a streaming version, a downloadable version, or there's a YouTube version that has like abstract animation to sort of, it's not like full character animation, but it's something to just sort of keep your eyes occupied while you're listening to it.
All right. And if people want to track down your other stuff, everything that you were talking about in the head of the show?
Oh, yeah. Immunities, my podcast, you can find it at immunities.com. Oh, actually, I'm sorry. Immunitiesdrama.com. Okay. There we go. Somebody already some medical person grabbed immunities.com.
No problem. I'll make sure I put a link in the show notes for everyone.
Cool.
Yeah.
And Insistent Oracles, the novel that I mentioned before, can be found on Amazon and Audible.
Cool. Very cool. Well, thanks so much for coming on to Black Clock Audio Tales and talking Frankenstein with us.
Oh, well, thanks for providing me a place to do so.
Yeah.
These are things that have been bubbling around for a long time, and
Sure.
it's nice to finally sort of get them straight in my head.
Yeah, no, anytime you want to come on and talk gothic horror, science fiction, anything like that, happy to have you on.
All right, well, thanks for keeping the spooky alive.
Yeah, no problem. Thanks, and we'll talk to you in the future, Bob.
All right.
All
Bye-bye.
right. Bye.